I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is John Mansfield. John runs the IBD service in Newcastle and has been active in the field for very many years. He's currently secretary of the IBD section of the BSG, but also chairs the clinical research group, and as such is the perfect speaker to talk on the next topic, which is how we can embed research into UK IBD services. John.
Stuart, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And it's absolutely a fantastic time to be in IBD research. So I hope I'm going to convince you of that in the next few minutes. There's an awful lot going on. You'll have seen a lot of stuff presented yesterday. Even the plenary sessions need to be taken over by IBD, which is great. So the UK is the place to be. I think that's something else I want to try and highlight to you. There's studies going on in America and Europe, but actually most of them are going on here. And the ones going on here are the best ones. So we've got an awful lot going on. Now, Richard Driscoll had a huge part in this success. With his leadership of NAC, as it was then called, and then later Crohn's Colitis UK, they did the IBD standards document and the IBD registry, and they are always supporters of patient involvement, nurse involvement, and research. So I think a huge tribute to Richard. I've only got 10 minutes for this, so the whole of IBD research in 10 minutes. So I selected the sort of 12, 15 major studies and wrote to my colleagues who run these studies saying, could you just send me one slide so I could highlight your bit of the study? And I got 75 slides back, right? So do we dig in for an hour-and-a-half session, or do we try and edit it? So I've tried to edit it. So I've got just a few slides to highlight a few thoughts. Declarations. It seemed to me that the way to look at this is a patient's journey. So a patient gets diagnosed with Crohn's disease or colitis, they have initial treatment, they have maintenance treatment, they have ongoing symptoms, they have side effects in their treatment. They want to think about experimental treatment if things don't go right. They want to think about stopping their treatment because they don't want it anymore, and they don't want to get bowel cancer. And that's just some of the steps on a patient journey which may last many, many years. So there's now research at every point in that 8-point scale. And I can't tell you about all of them, but I'm going to pick out a few things I think we should try and talk about. And I'm going to do next. The first thing I wanted to talk about was patients get diagnosed, and we don't know what causes inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's and colitis. But the IBD bioresource is a big national platform to involve at least 25,000 patients in a way that will involve those patients in research when they get diagnosed and any time afterwards, that they can then be invited to do more research in the future and they can be part of the research community. And I think that's a really valuable thing. It's also a big genetic study on the back of that, again, looking at sort of the 250 genes that we know about and working out how those genes cause the susceptibility to disease. Because we know the disease genes, we know about these genes, we know that they're there, but we don't know how they do it, and that's the next thing that we really need to work out. And we should be able to work that out. It's a logical step of where we are at the moment. So IBD bioresource, fantastic thing to get going. And then there's the prognosis, and we heard a lot about this from James in the plenary session yesterday, the idea that there may be predictors at the time of diagnosis that tell you how you're going to do. And there's the profile study at the moment, which is just launching, looking for 400 newly diagnosed Crohn's patients, which may be able to shed some light on the prognosis that people are going to have happen to them when they get diagnosed. And they've no idea. They've no idea if they're going to have one bad attack and then be well, or whether it's going to be a devastating lifelong condition. And maybe we can actually crack into that. So I think prognosis is a really exciting area to be involved in. Maintenance of remission, been fantastic work here from the Exeter group, the PANT study, looking at the things like the immunogenicity of the anti-TNF drugs, which I think will change the way we practice within the next year or two, and that's fantastic. And it's all come from the UK. It's all come from, that one particular has come from Exeter, but it hasn't just come from Exeter. And I'm going to show you in a moment that it's actually come from all over the country. It's been a collaborative work, which I think is almost unique to gastroenterology, and it's certainly the kind of thing that Richard supported and encouraged. I've picked out in my little list of 8 things ongoing symptoms of fatigue and pain and incontinence. And I've done this because of the BOOST study, which I know Richard was actually really very involved with. This is Professor Christine Norton's study. She's a professor of nursing at King's, and she's got a £2.3 million grant over 5 years to look at the managing the symptoms which patients really care about: pain, urgency, incontinence. And I think that's fantastic, and it kind of shows how far we've come, that we've got this kind of project going. Just give you a bit more outline of it, one slide. It's got a qualitative bit, which is the patient's priorities and run focus groups. It's got an online self-management program to try and pull together things that can be done to help patients with their symptoms. That's got a pilot study. There's then the cohort study to see how many of these symptoms really cause trouble, and then a randomized trial of online self-management package with nurse specialist support versus usual care in about 600 patients. That could make a huge difference to those symptoms that patients can never really get away from because they get them even when they're well, the fatigue and the incontinence and so on. So I think that's the kind of study which is great to be doing in the UK. We now have to step up and deliver it, and that's a challenge, but it's fantastic that it's happening here and happening now. Very briefly, side effects of treatment. This is a European collaborative iCare study, which Seb's leading on from Hull. And iCare is particularly good. I want to put in because in this study, patients enter their own data into the patient-specific database, which is centralized in Europe. And that means that we've got patients directly entering their own research data. I think that's fantastic. Taking large cohorts of patients on different treatments, infliximab, adalimumab, vedolizumab, ustekinumab, and seeing over 3 to 5 years what the nasty side effects might be. That's a bigger study than we could ever power as a investigator-led study, and it's just a really good European collaborative study, which I think it's great that the UK are not only delivering in, but actually the UK has delivered 2,468 patients, which is only just behind France and ahead of every other country. So I mentioned that things are collaborative. This is the Exeter work. This is actually the Exeter work on PRED4, which is the pharmacogenetics work. And they've been looking at, in particular for inflammatory bowel disease, the thiopurine-induced myelosuppression. And there aren't many bits of the country with people in them that haven't got a blue spike in them, right? So we know there are a lot of sheep in the blank bits and trees up in the Kielder, but and Scotland's kind of less populated. But actually, if there's people, there's a blue pin, because we're doing this research everywhere. And I think that's really important. And I think it's really good. It's world-class research. This is top of the pile in Europe and America presentations, and it's coming from Exeter. Okay, experimental treatment. This is traditional trials, traditional IBD trials, and I just want to mention 4 of them very briefly, or at least 3 or 4 of them. IARSO is a trial that's just setting up, which is somewhat complicated, and it's named after a Greek goddess, which is just to confuse people. But the point of this study is whether we can do something in the acute severe colitic setting. So a patient comes into hospital with severe ulcerative colitis, we always give them IV steroids. That's what we've done since I was at medical school. And maybe we could do something a wee bit better. So this is the idea of giving them anakinra, and it's a randomized placebo-controlled trial of acute treatment in acute ulcerative colitis. There's nowhere else in the world that's doing that. So we should be proud to be doing IBD research in the UK. We've also got other studies which are also internationally leading. The ASTIC Light study is following on from the ASTIC trial of autologous stem cell transplantation. That's now launched, funded, launched and running. James Lindsay's running it from London. Really good study, only 8 centres in the UK, so it's not for everybody. It's very top-end treatment. It's not expecting many patients, but it's potentially life-changing for those that do it. And then, what about stop colitis? Stop colitis is a fecal transplant study. So the idea is that if you change the bowel flora in a big way by actually putting somebody else's flora in, maybe that changes the disease. And this is a big enough study which, with a pilot and then a 230-patient trial run from Edinburgh and London, should actually answer some of that. So again, the kind of research that is happening in the UK, we should be really proud about it. There are lots of others. There's also a whole fistful of commercial drug trials, which we're participating in, but most of them are run by international drug companies that need to get their drugs licensed. Sure, we need to be involved in those trials, but I think it's the investigator-led stuff that I've shown you, which is really where our hearts should be, where we need to really deliver the goods. We're getting towards the end of the patient journey. Stopping treatment is always something patients, when they're really well, they want to do. Most of them just do it. They just stop taking their tablets. But if they're injections they have to turn up a hospital for, it has to be a bit more official. So stopping treatment when it's not needed is what the SPARE trial is all about. This is a European JET-AID trial, which again the UK is collaborating in and providing some fair number of patients to answer questions about whether patients can actually have less treatment. And then colon cancer risk, there's a study run from Birmingham looking to see if we can better detect precancerous changes. So a couple more slides, just some practical tips for research in the IBD clinics. I think these are kind of obvious, but I'm going to put them up and just go through them because I think it's important to say. If you're going to do IBD research in the NHS clinics, you need to involve the whole team. That's the colleagues, so that it doesn't just get research opportunity if they see you, they've got research opportunity if they see anybody in the clinic. The IBD nurses, the clinic nurses, the infusion unit nurses, the secretaries, and almost most of all the patients via the patient groups, but the patients via social media as well. So IBD research is for the whole team. Have the IBD research nurses come down to the clinic, have a summary of the trials that are open in every clinic room, and have the patient information sheets in the clinic ready to give the patient. So it can all be just smoothed out. This is obvious, but if you don't do it, then the patients don't go into the trials. And if the patients, God forbid, if actually wait in the waiting room because you're not quite on schedule that day, then use that time to prime them about research. Have the banners up, the posters up. So the patients come in saying, I've seen the poster about the bioresource, can I do it, please? All right? So, or if you've forgotten to tell them, the patients nudged you and said, I want to be in that one. And then last point, only do trials that you care about. If you wouldn't do the trial as a patient, then don't run it as a doctor. So feel quite strongly about that. I think all the trials I've ever done, we've been trials that, given the right circumstances, I would volunteer to do. And if you wouldn't, if you've got reservations about it, just leave that one, find some others. So my conclusions, last slide, I think IBD research in the UK is a great place to be, great time to be here. Any IBD unit in the UK can participate in most of the studies I've shown you, Acetate Light being the exception, but most of them we can set up anywhere. It takes a while, but we can get it going. There's an investigator meeting, 12th of November, so if anybody wants to come and learn how to set up the studies and actually get into it and get their unit going, watch the BSG website and come to that meeting. And I think the ambition should be that every IBD patient in every IBD clinic should be offered an opportunity to participate in research. And that's where I'd like us to be going. I think that'd be a fitting tribute to Richard's memory. Thanks.